I found out that Hammer was very, very interested in the 60s to remake King Kong. They wanted to remake King Kong. They were very interested in the story. And I heard that, and I was like, that makes total sense, because, let's say, Hammer was at the height of their power, and they were looking for a giant monster movie to make. And they never really did. They made 1 million years BC instead. In fact, I think because they had such a snafu trying to get the rights to King Kong that they just gave up. It wasn't worth it. In fact, that's exactly what happened. But I think because of that, they wound up making 1 million years BC. So if you really look at the chain of events that happened, we could have actually gotten a Ray Harryhausen animated King Kong. Because I bet you they would have done him in stop motion. Now, the question that I have for all of you is, do you think, with Ray Harryhausen's magic at work, do you think Kong in this Hammer version would look as good as the original? What type of film do you think would happen? In fact, that's what I want to talk about right now is, let's spitball. What would a Hammer King Kong look like? A Hammer Studios King Kong look like? Because outside of Toho, I love Hammer Studios. I absolutely love the Hammer horror movies. Haven't really had a chance to talk about it, mainly because you guys tend to not give a fuck. Because it's not Godzilla. Excuse me. But I love this idea, because let's just let this sink in. We could have had Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee in a King Kong movie. Now that you've let that sink in, just think of how fucking awesome that would have been. Peter Cushing certainly would have probably have been the Carl Denham-esque character. I'd be curious who Christopher Lee would be. Christopher Lee might have been like the Captain Englehorn style character. But to me, that's minuscule compared to what would Hammer have done with the story. And somebody did a great video on YouTube saying, sort of speculating what a Hammer Studios King Kong would look like. And I really liked that video, and I'm actually tempted to do one of my own. But Hammer often had their films take place in like the late 1800s, like the turn of the century is when most of their movies take place, I should say. Most of their horror movies take place. Excuse me. Would have their version of the film also have taken place at this time period? Because if that's the case, one, it would have been a period. It would have suddenly become a period piece, which wasn't a thing until King Kong 05. But also, that would fundamentally change a lot of the story of the original King Kong. Now, it is also very clear that Edgar Wallace, who is a very famous horror writer, wrote the first few drafts of King Kong 33, and his version was definitely more horror based. For example, the biplanes don't kill Kong at the end of that movie. He was struck down by lightning and stuff like that. I bet you Hammer would have picked that up as well. They would have probably have had him climb up to the top of Big Ben or something like that and have Kong struck by lightning instead of being shot down by biplanes. Though I don't know, because there's just so little information out there. We just know that they really wanted to make a King Kong movie. But I think probably the biggest thing that I'd be worried about if Hammer made King Kong, and why I would say it wouldn't really have been a good movie, it would have been an okay movie. And that's, Hammer was a very low-budget independent company. Now, I bet you they would have sunk a lot of money into a King Kong project because King Kong was known. And, of course, 1952 was not that long ago for them, and that was as I said earlier, a big success regardless of if it being a movie released at the time or not. Sorry, I'm just really paranoid that my audio doesn't work, so I've been checking my stream now more frequently. But I think what we would have seen, if I really sit down, would have been more in line with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World. It would have been far more in line like that. because I think Carl Denham wouldn't have been a filmmaker. He would have been like an archaeologist of some kind that thinks he's found this island with an ape on it, and he brings a couple people along. I don't think there would have been a movie involved at all. I think it would have been maybe a circus guy goes with them and stuff like that. Maybe he's more of our Carl Denham than actually our Carl Denham character. Probably that's what we would have seen, and we definitely would have had a lot more cleavage in this movie than we would have necessarily gotten, nor what we actually saw in the other Kong remakes, including the original. But I think Peter Cushing would have played that sort of mad scientist trying to find it, and it probably would have been his idea to capture Kong, to bring him on a circus of some kind or something in London. It certainly would have taken place in England. It definitely would have taken place in England, not in New York, which is so funny because that would drastically change the story of King Kong. You know, the big finale of King Kong is that he's in New York City. He's not in LA or anything like that. He's in New York City. So changing it to London probably would have been more in line with Conga. And I'm not meaning that as an insult. I just mean structure-wise and stuff like that. It would look a little bit more like a cross between Gorgo and Conga. And the reason why they wanted to remake King Kong was because they knew these giant monster movies were selling like mad, not just in Japan, but all across the planet. People were lining up in droves to see these movies. Plus, the King brothers finally released their own giant monster movie because the King brothers had released Rodan to the West, essentially. So the United States, Canada, Mexico, the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. They had released their version of that, and that was the highest grossing, according to David Callett, that was the highest grossing science fiction movie that year, was Rodan. So a tremendous hit. So they finally make Gorgo, their film, and they use a lot of the same special effects techniques as, you know, Eiji Tsuburaya was doing over in Japan, and it looks great. I mean, the weakest part of Gorgo is definitely its story by far, but visually it looked phenomenal. And that movie, too, was a big hit. I mean, not necessarily as large of a hit outside of England, but in England it was a big hit. Of course, I could see Hammer being like, we can do that. And they try to make King Kong. So it makes sense to me that they could do this, that they would at least try to do this. But like I've heard a lot of people say that they probably would have done the stop motion route. They probably would have actually gotten Ray Harryhausen to do the special effects. And it's clear that they were at least trying to make a more expensive movie because of 1 million years BC. They did. They poured a decent amount of change into 1 million years BC. But the biggest thing that they dumped into 1 million years BC, more than change and money per se, was time, because it takes a lot of time to do stop motion animation. And Ray Harryhausen took a long time to work. I mean, Jason and the Argonauts, was filmed 2 years before it was released. It took him that long to do the stop motion animation for it after the live action stuff was done. So, if they weren't going to do stop motion animation for King Kong, they would have to do a guy in a suit similar to what they did in Kong 76. They probably would have actually gotten David Prowse to play King Kong. If they didn't get David Prowse to play King Kong, they might have gotten Christopher Lee. And before people crucify me, let me explain why. And that's because Christopher Lee was known for playing the monster for a little while. He played Dracula, of course, no duh. He played Frankenstein's first creation in the first Frankenstein movie. And he also played the mummy in The Mummy. And he did phenomenal in The Mummy. And why I think he would do good as King Kong as well is because in The Mummy, all he has are his eyes to do a lot of his acting. And that's why that movie, you have a bit of sympathy for The Mummy, is because of Christopher Lee's eyes. And just with his eyes, he was able to convey a shit ton of emotion. So put that guy in a gorilla suit, and he probably would have done great. And that's not knocking David Prowse either. David Prowse probably would have done great. I bet you at that point, Christopher Lee might have said no, though, because I know he was drastically trying to avoid just getting typecasted as the big baddie, and back in the 60s, people would still see Kong as the baddie instead of the more sympathetic Kong that we know now. But I think they probably would have gone stop motion in the end. Now, what would the island look like? What would Skull Island in the story? and what goes on with it, because Rick Baker hated the story to Kong 76. Nevertheless, he did it, and that sort of tarnished a lot of his experience making the movie. I mean, yeah, it's hard. He went through hell making the movie, but he's done that a lot before. So I bet you Skull Island would not have been a jungle. In fact, I bet you if Hammer had made King Kong, I'll bet you Kong would have been probably on an island similar to what we saw in 1 million years BC. In fact, I'll say it again because I can't remember if I said this when my mic fucked up or not, but to make it clear now, Kong, I personally believe that 1 million years BC came out of the failure to make King Kong. And so I bet you they would have used a lot of the same locations that they used that we saw in 1 million years BC in their King Kong movie. And I bet you even some of the actors that we saw in in 1 million years BC, they would have brought over into King Kong. I bet you we would have seen Raquel Welch. Maybe Raquel Welch would have been this version's Ann Darrow. That would have been interesting. I mean, she's definitely got the looks and the clout to do it. It certainly would have been interesting. And I know that they were in talks with Raquel Welch because of 1 million years BC. And as I said earlier, I believe 1 million years BC came out of their failure to make King Kong. So maybe that's what would have happened. So they were clearly their mind was rolling in this direction anyway. So probably that's what would have happened. So it would have been a drastically different film than the original King Kong, to the point that I would almost say that it probably wouldn't have really felt like a King Kong movie per se. It would have felt more like, well, quite frankly, The Lost World, which is interesting because I thought if Hammer was going to turn something into and have dinosaurs in it and stuff like that, they did 1 million years BC, but I'm always surprised that they never did The Lost World. If Hammer did The Lost World, it would have been fantastic. It would have been just fantastic. They would have really played up the horror. They really would have played up a lot of things. Test. Okay. And I would have really loved it. In fact, I think quite frankly, Hammer's The Lost World would have been significantly better than than the one made by Irwin Allen, which I think was a bad film. I really don't like Irwin Allen's The Lost World. I think it was just a waste of a movie, especially Claude Rains. God, I think that movie was really cheap special effects and stuff like that, even for the day. I mean, it was just lizards with horns glued to their heads and stuff like that. Yeah, definitely a different kind of movie. And I personally, I think Hammer was better off for not making King Kong. I think we kind of dodged a bullet there, if I'm being completely honest, because I don't think Hammer had the talent behind them. They had the talent to make these wonderful horror movies. Don't get me wrong. They had the directors behind it, which, by the way, I think Terrence Fisher would have directed it. If not, you see, that all depends, too, because if they went with stop-motion animation, Ray Harryhausen probably would have had to say on the director, because they need somebody with experience with that, which is why he chose Don Chaffee, who directed Jason and the Argonauts, to direct 1 million years BC. They probably would have gone with Don Chaffee to direct Hammer's King Kong. They probably would have selected him. But if they weren't doing stop-motion animation and were doing more traditional, maybe suitmation and puppetry and stuff like that, they might have gone with Terrence Fisher, because this was a more higher-end production. They tended to give the more higher-end productions at Hammer to Terrence Fisher because he proved to be one of their money-making directors. But maybe it would have gone to Freddie Francis. I don't really know. This is very interesting. And I can see all three of those directors making a vastly different movie.